If there's one thing I want to stress, it's just how bad fantasizing is for your spiritual and overall growth as a person. And I'm living proof. Fantasizing actively took away so many experiences I could have had as a teenager. And no doubt changed my life completely and put me on a whole different path. Going into grade 9, I had a lot of anxiety, a lot of social anxiety. I was too scared to go out with friends when invited, too afraid to ask girls out, too afraid to be a person. So I went home and I fantasized. I fantasized about finding the perfect girl, about everything working out in the end, finding my perfect job, being rich one day, being really good looking, and just having everything come into place. What made this experience so dangerous was I started to believe these fantasies, because if you have these kinds of thoughts long enough, these irrational thoughts, slowly they become almost facts to you, as if they're going to happen. You start to convince yourself it's just true. For example, if you tell yourself every single day you're going to find that perfect one, the one that's going to give you all the happiness in the world, that perfect girl, you're going to start to believe that lie that you keep telling yourself every single day. And you eventually start to act out the way you think. So you become comfortable with this idea, like the one will come eventually, the one will come without me having to try, the one will come when the time is right. And then you just sit there and you do nothing, and you basically just start rotting, because you're not working on yourself, you're not working on your social skills, you're not hanging out with people, you're not talking to girls, you're just staying at home, gaming, and thinking and fantasizing. And then 5 years later, you wake up one day and realize none of these fantasies are going to come true. You're in a state worse than you were 5 years prior, and you realize you've made a terrible mistake. Now at this point, you only have one of two options. One, you can wake up and immediately get your life back on track and realize you've been lying to yourself. Or two, you can dive even deeper into these fantasies and hide away from life and ultimately amount to nothing in the end. Like I said, I am living proof of this. When I entered into grade 9, like I've said, I retreated away from all social activities and began fantasizing. I told myself all these lies of things working out. And then one day, coming out of high school, all of a sudden I realized I had no experience talking to girls, I had poor social skills, and I had no idea how to find a job that was actually right for me. I just assumed I'd find the job that's right for me because the universe would call me towards it. I put in actually no work into actually exploring what I'm passionate about or what I believe my purpose is in life. This was very detrimental to my mental health when I realized that my ideal life was no longer going to line up with my actual life. And my first reaction to it was actually denial. When I first found out that, okay, wait a second, the fantasy is not lining up with reality. I imagined by 18 I would be all these things, and I'm nowhere close to any. In fact, I'm worse off than I imagined I could have ever been. So then what happened was a lot of mental health issues, extreme depression, extreme anxiety. I developed a lot of bad habits, with drugs and gaming and things like that. And that only made everything worse. And the fantasies were just so persistent. And then one day I had a moment of clarity, and I will never forget that day. And it set me on the right path. Talking about that day where I had that moment of clarity, actually I'm going to make another video about that day eventually, because I believe that day is worth a whole story in and of itself. But anyways, after that day, when I had my moment of clarity, by the way, was just a realization that I hate myself and I hate where I'm at in life. And this sounds obviously super negative, and of course it was, but my viewpoint all of a sudden changed to, I'm terrible, let's make this worse. And all of a sudden it flipped just like a switch to, I'm terrible, let's make this better. Let's make this life better. The first thing I had to do was get rid of the fantasies. I had to destroy the fantasies and to stop believing them. So one of the first things I started doing is whenever I got a fantasy in my head, I kind of gave it a label in my head, like a red flag, stating that clearly I am self-aware that this is a fantasy and is unrealistic. just so whenever these kinds of thoughts came along, I could label them as unrealistic and unproductive. And therefore, I would no longer internalize them, or over time, I would internalize them less. And surprisingly, as time went on, these fantasy thoughts started appearing less and less. The next thing I had to do was obviously work on my mental health. This was done through meditation, re-strengthening what friendships I did have, positive self-affirmations, boosting my self-esteem, forgiving myself for mistakes, and actually liking myself. Even though I was in a place where I really felt I didn't deserve to be liked, I loved myself and took care of myself. That is the first step to improving, is fixing your mental health. And you'll find quite fast that once you actually fix your mental health, get your mental health in shape, that's when these fantasies will lose their strength to the most extreme extent. Because these fantasies pry a lot on depression and anxiety. They give you these promises and they offer nothing in return. They keep you lazy and at home doing nothing. Instead of fantasizing about meeting the perfect girl, you should have been out there talking to girls and actually experimenting, improving your skills, and learning what a realistic relationship is like. Instead of fantasizing about the perfect job, you should have been studying what jobs are best for you, what are best suited to your unique skill sets, getting out there volunteering, just learning. And it's easier said than done. But to get to this point, it's genuinely a journey. It's been a journey for me. Since my moment of realization, a journey has now been about 5 years now. So I've come a very far distance in these 5 years. And actually, a lot of this speed only ramped up in the last 2 years. It's exponential growth. For the first 3 years, it was very slow. The growth in my confidence, my mental health, my depression, anxiety levels were lowering. The second last year, it sped up dramatically. And in the very last year, it's speeding up at such an extreme extent that I am getting more than excited at where I believe it's going to go. Because who I was out of high school versus me 5 years later, I never would have dreamed I would have been able to climb this high again. I have been spending the last 5 years trying to reverse the damage of all the fantasizing I did as a teenager. And that's not easy, but you have to start somewhere. I guess the main takeaway from this video is, if you want to get to a position in life where you feel you are better, you are physically healthier, you are mentally healthier, your social ties are stronger, you're better with girls, you're better with your family. If you want to get to that position in life where you want to improve, the first thing you need to do is stop fantasizing. No fantasies at all. Now, if you already don't fantasize, then that's amazing. Some people never fantasized in life. That was never an issue for them. I mean, everybody naturally fantasizes to an extent, but there's a lot of people that have never been consumed by fantasies. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people that have been consumed by fantasies. These people typically tend to be higher in depression, higher in anxiety. They typically tend to be actually very creative individuals and very introverted. These combination of traits can create a very nasty result, surprisingly. So one of your first steps to improving as a human being on your spiritual journey is no doubt to stop fantasizing. And this is the first step would be obviously like this, to label your fantasies, as I said, to just understand every time you have a fantasy or unrealistic thought and just label it as such. You'd be surprised what a difference this will make over time, because your brain will learn to stop internalizing these things and stop telling itself lies that it'll actually believe. Because inside your brain, it's a lot like an echo chamber. So the kind of thoughts you throw around will become reality for you eventually. If you practice things such as exercising or meditation or journaling and being very self-aware and talking with friends, going outside, getting experiences if you can, you'll find very fast that your fantasy toxic thoughts are going to decrease rapidly. And so will your depression and anxiety. This is a guarantee for most people. So, as a rational next step, what I would do is I would write a journal every morning of thoughts you felt you've had that are unrealistic. And over the next course of a month, just see the trends in these thoughts, kind of understand where these fantasies are coming from and exactly what you want. Because these fantasies are obviously fueled by your desires. So if you get a fantasy about, finding the perfect girl, well, break apart that fantasy and say, okay, so me thinking about getting the perfect girl is not going to make her appear in front of me. So from that fantasy that you just wrote down in your journal, develop a strategy plan right after it on how you could actually realistically find the perfect girl. Talk to girls more, talk to friends, get advice, or ask that cashier out, such and such. Just create a game plan on how to get to that. It's very scary for some people, I know this, but it's the only way. And you will be so glad if you start now instead of start later. Because for the first few years, and I say first few years, you may be struggling. You may be put down every single time. You may be rejected every single time and lose hope. But you have to start somewhere. And the first few years might be rough. But like I said, the growth is exponential. So for the first few years, it's not going to be incredibly noticeable. And then as time goes on, it'll start speeding up so fast you won't even know what's going on. This is exactly what has happened to me. So that would be your main game plan. And trust me, it'll be worth it in the end, because at the end of the day, there's only going to be two versions of you in the future. Let's say you're 60 years old in the future. You could be that guy who spent his whole life fantasizing and now has nothing and is depressed. Or you could be that guy who gave up the fantasies and went out to life and actually took it on as a challenge. And now he actually has all these things that he would have maybe fantasized about otherwise. There's one other thing I should mention about fantasies that I forgot to mention earlier, and that is fantasies also, they set up very unrealistic expectations, because there's no such thing as a perfect woman. There's no such thing as the perfect job. There's no such thing as perfection. And fantasies love to sell the idea of perfection. So fantasies kind of set you up to be let down by reality. And that's a very bad mindset to put yourself in. You need to understand that reality is very flawed, and that's what makes reality perfect. So give up the fantasies. They're lying to you, and they're keeping you down, and they're never going to let you grow, and the goals they set for you aren't even realistic. Ground your expectations and actually put in the hard work, and you'll be happier than you could have ever been fantasizing. I promise this. I promise this so much. Anyways, until next time.